Hello and welcome to York Universe, the astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. I'm Sana, I'll be one of your hosts this evening, and I'm joined by Gagan. Hi, Gagan.
Hi.
We are broadcasting live from the Allan Carswell Observatory located at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We broadcast every Monday night at 9 p.m. local Toronto time or Tuesday morning at 1 a.m. Universal time. The York Universe production works in concert with our online public viewing program run by the Observatory team, which runs between the hours of 9 to 10 p.m. local Toronto time. Go to yorku.ca/science/observatory and follow the links to our online public viewing to join the chat. Or you could just head over to our YouTube channel and join over there as well. For any questions or comments you have about any of our past shows, or if you have any suggestions for future topics, you could please send us an email at observe@yorku.ca. And you could also always connect with us on social media, on Instagram with the handle @YorkU and on Facebook at Allan I. Carswell Obs. All of our programs are free, but if you'd like to make a donation, please see our website at yorku.ca/science/observatory. Unfortunately, the weather in Toronto is not looking all that great at the moment. We had a couple nights of clear skies last week, but we're just getting a whole bunch of rain and clouds right now, so we won't be able to do any live imaging with the 1 meter tonight. But we do have our fantastic observatory crew showing some archival images on the OPV tonight. So definitely lots of pretty pictures and cool things to look at over there. Well, Gagan, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. Been enjoying the nice weather for the last few days, but unfortunately today, yeah, conditions are not great for observing.
No.
Yeah, we were blessed with a lot of really clear nights last week, which was really nice. Caught the ISS a couple of times completely by
Mm.
accident, which is always a great surprise.
Oh
Um,
yeah, that's always the best thing to just like, you're randomly looking up and you see just the bright International Space Station zipping across the
yeah,
sky.
and then you can check it afterwards. It's great.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
we had some great planets up, which we'll talk about at our little halftime show. And other than that, been doing some plane watching as often as I can. There's been some
Oh my
interesting
God.
stuff recently, yeah. But yeah, nothing much.
Yeah, pretty much the same. York is really great for plane watching.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's just like just completely randomly, you'll just get like a really cool plane coming overhead, which is always nice.
Yeah, so one of the runways that the Toronto Pearson Airport uses for all of our non-Toronto listeners, um, one of our runways, the path of flight goes right over York University. So whenever there are a lot of great viewing spots for plane spotting, and we're lucky if we can get some big planes. I know the A380 flies in and out once a day.
Hmm.
And then we have a couple 747s, and sometimes you can get some interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, on the atrium tours, because the runway is basically lined up with York, it's actually possible to point one of the small telescopes at the planes and get them as they're coming in for landing.
Oh,
Because
wow.
yeah, like they move pretty quickly, but they're essentially coming right at you. So for a few minutes, you can actually like take one of the Bushnell, the small telescope, and just point it right along the flight path for planes landing on the runway and actually just catch them as they're coming in, which is
Oh my
pretty fun.
gosh. Yeah, because they would technically be stationary if they're coming almost right towards you.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So like this is one of the rare times that it's actually easy to see planes through telescopes because they're just coming right at you.
Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to make it out for an atrium tour.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll do reminders about the tours next week, but we should have a few more atrium tours in the schedule for this year before it gets too freezing cold and too snowy to be out there. Um, but yeah, I guess that's a bit more for the reminders section later on.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah, yeah. But we should probably get started with our this week in space and astronomy history. So I'm the first one up tonight with September 29th, 1962, which is a pretty important date for Canadian, space travel and Canada's activities, and because it's the anniversary of when Canada launched their satellite called Alouette, which I'm not sure why, but this just feels like a really Canadian name. I just can't really put my finger on why. I'm not sure if you agree. But Alouette 1, so anniversary of the launch of Alouette 1. This also made Canada the third nation ever to put a manned satellite into space, of course, following the USSR with the Sputnik satellite and the United States for one a few years earlier. Alouette 1 was partly run by Canada and also had some contributions from the United States space program. So it was run by the newly formed NASA agency, which was formed from the NACA, sort of nice way to say that, a few years earlier, and officially sort of shifted into the current NASA that we know and love now. It was at the time run by Canada's Research Telecommunications Establishment, so not the Canadian Space Agency. And specifically, the way the duties for one were divided up is that would help with the testing and launching the satellite, since they had the capabilities to actually launch satellites into space. Whereas Canada would work on the other side of things, where they would be responsible for paying for the satellite, designing it, and building it. So sort of a little bit of split of responsibility between Canada and with Canada taking the lead on a lot of things with for Alouette 1. Now, originally when for Alouette 1 was started, it was meant to just be a single satellite which would probe the ionosphere. So this is a part of the Earth's upper atmosphere. It starts at around an altitude of 50 kilometers. I believe it goes up to around 1,000 kilometers. And it's sort of differentiated from the lower part of the atmosphere because the lower part of the atmosphere is neutral. But when you start to get to altitudes of above 50 kilometers, you get very harsh solar radiation that's hitting a lot of areas in the atmosphere, and it starts to actually ionize all of the atoms in the atmosphere. So you have a lot of charged particles, electrons and other sort of ions floating around in the Earth's atmosphere. So at around this time when Alouette 1 was sort of designed and launched, scientists and engineers were really starting to realize how important the upper atmosphere, like the ionosphere, was towards things like GPS transmissions or sort of radio signals and stuff like that that they had been relying on. So we now know that the ionosphere is very important for things like that. And it was kind of around that time that they were starting to figure out how important the upper atmosphere was. So there was a little bit of a push to send probes into space to try and study the upper atmosphere, learn more about it, and learn how that can impact things that humans are kind of doing on Earth. So Alouette 1 was essentially just designed to be part of that mission to learn more about the upper atmosphere and the ionosphere. It had a suite of 4 instruments on board, which would do things like measure radio noise around the upper atmosphere and also learn more about the charged particles that existed in the ionosphere. Now, on top of being a pretty interesting mission from a scientific perspective, this was also a pretty cool mission just from a technology standpoint. It actually required developing a whole lot of new technology to send the satellite into space to have it function correctly. Because one of the things that Alouette 1 needed to do was to be able to measure radio waves. So it actually required a massive 45-meter antenna to be able to detect the kind of radio waves it was interested in. But, just like today, when we're launching things into space today, the space in the rocket is never actually enough to accommodate what you want, which was the problem with Alouette 1. There was only about 1 meter of space in the rocket to fit this massive 45-meter antenna. So engineers had to come up with this cool device that they called the Storable Tubular Extendable Member, or STEM, which would essentially allow for a massive 45-meter antenna to be rolled up within 1 meter so that it could actually launch to space, and then use motors to essentially unroll it into the massive antenna that it needed to function. So the article that I read sort of compared this to like the retract measuring tapes that you can find sometimes, whereas kind of a similar concept where you could just roll the entire thing up and then extend it once it was in space. So I guess they were just facing a lot of the same problems that engineers and scientists still face today when you're trying to launch satellites. So after a whole bunch of preparation the Alouette 1 launched on September 29th, 1962, aboard a Thor Agena rocket from the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Another interesting little tidbit about this satellite is that there was a little bit of debate about what the actual launch date of the satellite was, because at the time that it launched, it was actually September 28th local time, but September 29th universal time. So when I say September 29th, I mean it's actually the universal time that was adopted as the official launch date. But this was, I guess, in the very early days of launching things into space. So there was a little bit of debate about whether or not they should use the universal time or the local time designation. But ultimately, the universal time designation won out to avoid confusion. Now, overall, the Alouette 1 was a really fantastic mission. It was designed to last only 1 year in space, but it ended up lasting 10 years in space, which is extra remarkable when you first satellite that Canadian engineers had actually built and put into space, and considering how early in sort of the space travel era this was. So it's pretty remarkable that it was able to last for like 10 times longer than its actual proposed mission duration. On top of that, it really helped to establish the role of Canadian scientists as experts on the upper atmosphere, and also, of course, as Canadian engineers are people who should be trusted to do things like design and build satellites. It ultimately ended up leading to 3 additional satellites, which were also conducted jointly between Canada and the United States, including the Alouette 2 satellite, which is essentially just a modified version of Alouette 1, and a couple different satellites, which were called the International Satellites for Ionospheric Studies number 1 and 2. Second mission for Canada on September 29th, 1962.
Wow, yeah. I always like to see when missions last much longer than they were intended to. It just kind of feels so much more worthwhile.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think at this point, NASA has a pretty long history of like under promising and over delivering. I think how it's always put.
Absolutely.
It's kind of a bit more like expect now when satellites end up lasting for so much longer than their actual mission duration. But the thing that kind of gets me at one is like this was Canada's very first satellite, so it's pretty insane that it actually ended up lasting years.
Yeah.
It should have lasted for one. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of gives us a good standing in terms of putting our own spacecraft up. Because I
Hmm.
think most of the other missions that we've hopped in on are usually instrumental, or like we donate specific instruments or specific parts to an overall mission that is largely footed by another agency, usually
Hmm.
NASA.
Yeah.
But it's really nice to see Canada having its own flowers.
Yeah. And Canada, I think, is actually planning a space telescope, like their own space telescope,
Mm.
not collaboration with any other space agencies. So I forget what the timeline on that was, but I do remember there has been some discussion of Castor at Casca meetings. Um,
Okay.
so that would be pretty cool to have a very own Canadian space telescope out there too.
Absolutely. And priority on, observing time as well would be fantastic because,
Hmm.
the telescopes, they're booked up.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So it'd be great to have our own space telescope. Um,
Yeah.
but you also have another interesting history item for more Ontarians specifically.
Yeah. So for any of our local listeners, this is probably something you've heard about on the news recently, especially over the last couple of months. And I'm sure you and I will have lots to talk about this one. But coming up in a couple of days is the 55th anniversary of the opening of the Ontario Science Centre. So on September 26th in 1969, the Ontario Science Centre opened its doors to the public for the very first time. It's an institution that's well loved by schools. It was an ideal field trip destination and home to various exhibits that showcased various branches of science, including and beyond astronomy and space travel. They covered biology, environmental sciences, human anatomy, arts, engineering and mathematics, various exhibits around physics. So they really covered everything. For example, they had a Living Earth exhibit, which had huge simulated habitats, including a really big rainforest. They had coral reefs, they had caves, and they were all populated with real vegetation and live animals. So, a lot of really cool exhibits. They had a human anatomy exhibit that had over 80 different activities and models for students and other visitors to learn about human anatomy and physiology. And they had interactive stations where people could test out their reflexes, their strength. They had a climbing wall and a whole bunch of other activities. And the Ontario Science Centre was also home to Toronto's only functioning public planetarium since 1995 when the McLaughlin Planetarium closed down. And this exhibit um, that included the planetarium also included meteorites from Mars as well as rock samples from the moon, which are the only publicly available moon rocks in Canada. So, really exciting opportunities for students to go and learn about space travel and other types of science. The center has also run specific exhibits for months at a time that showcase specific scientific themes, including exhibits on space travel. They've had exhibits on life beyond Earth, and is also really commonly used as the venue for student fairs and graduate research exhibitions. I'm not sure if you remember, Senna, but I think in 2019, a lot of the graduate students from York had a couple of exhibits set up at the Science Center in August. And we basically set up interactive games where kids and their parents would come in and they would team up with other families. And I remember the exhibit that I was a part of, they were teamed up and designing rovers for specific planetary ex specific planetary missions that had specific science objectives. So they had to pick the instrumentation that they wanted on the rover. They had to pick whether they were going to sacrifice certain instrumentation. They had to pick an ideal landing site. So definitely really cool opportunities for people of all ages to learn about science. And I have to talk about the Science Center in the past tense because it was recently closed pretty abruptly due to um, just some maintenance stuff that resulted in building deteriorating, specifically the roof. So plans are currently underway to relocate the Science Center to a harborfront location near Ontario Place. But it's a shame that the next few years of Ontario students will be without the opportunity to explore the Science Center because it was a really great institution and part of the big expansion of Toronto in the 60s and 70s. It opened up about the same time, I believe the same year that York, the observatory opened its doors. So lots of big things happening for science in the 60s and 70s, and it's a shame to see these things go.
Yeah, it's I was pretty sad to hear about the Ontario Science Center. I definitely remember going there myself a few times, and I also remember how exciting it was to have like a field trip that was going to go to the Ontario Science Center um, when I was in school. So that was pretty fun. Definitely disappointing that it's closing. So hopefully the new location will open soon. I'm not sure what the plans are for any like potential opening dates. Do you know?
I'm not sure either because, as far as I'm aware, I don't think the location is even set in stone. I know they have a plan for it to be on those pods,
Hmm.
but the actual area there, I believe, is a lot smaller. And we will lose some of the exhibits in the Science Center because
Hmm.
um, it was designed by Raymond Moriyama, who is who was a really great Toronto-based architect, and he basically built the Science Center into the side of the Don River Valley.
Oh my
And
God.
yeah, so it's like built into the side of the ravine, and they actually have a couple of exhibits that involve the ravine itself, where they talk about trees and forestry. They show you how tree rings demonstrate a tree's life experience. So it shows how trees age and how you can see how old a tree is. And they also have exhibits about the wildlife that we have in Ontario that was all located within the Don River Valley. And it's a really beautiful location. Most of the, I mean, I was there in 2019 and it honestly seemed like it was in really great shape. Um, so there's definitely going to be some loss of exhibits because I don't know how well they're going to create an entire rainforest again outside of the Don River Valley. Because they really, Moriyama definitely embraced the nature and habitat that Science Center was placed in as part of the experience of the Science Center. They really tried to embrace the location and the habitat when they were thinking about what to build. So I'm not sure how it's going to compare to the original, but I hope it does a good job. And I don't think there's a time. I would seriously doubt if it was anything within 5 or 6 years.
Oh yeah, yeah, like that's a pretty genius idea to literally build the city into the science center. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, with how slow a lot of construction goes, it's probably going to be a while, especially if they don't have like an actual location pinned down. But it's definitely unfortunate.
Yeah, I think once we have building plans for the new location, it'll be better. I know they sent the Ontario government proposed a tentative plan for what they would design the Science Center as, and it would basically be a series of domes on those pods, which for anybody unfamiliar, it's actually kind of 6 islands that are located on the water um, on the Toronto harbor front. And they basically plan to put the Ontario Science Center in different buildings on those different pods. So each one would have different exhibits that I figure would have a specific theme, but they don't have any concrete plans about when this will happen and how they plan to execute it.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. But hopefully they can make a another very good Ontario Science Center because that's a really great thing to have in Toronto. Just from many different aspects, it's a great thing to have around. So
Yeah, great for families, great for kids, really introduces younger kids to science, which I know a lot of the basic science curriculum when it comes to elementary school is it's really early science. This kind of gives
hmm.
them an opportunity to see what type of science interests them.
Oh
So,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
it's even
but you're
kind
gonna
of
have
cool to go to as an adult.
100%.
Like
I
just
love
yeah, there's
taking kids there.
yeah, there's so much just cool stuff that you can just play around with. So um
They
yeah,
had that
it'll definitely
magnetic
be missed.
a magnetic sphere where you put your hand on it and all your hair sticks out in all
Oh
directions.
yeah,
I
I
remember that.
remember
That was
that.
something
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, that was actually like the first thing I thought about when you mentioned the Ontario Science Center.
Yeah.
But
No, I remember I was so scared of that thing. And my mom was like, okay, just do it. Like it'll be fun. And it was so cool, but it was such an odd sensation.
hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
really
Well,
did like the interactive aspect of everything.
yeah, you really can't beat that when you're doing public outreach, especially with kids, just having people do hands-on things with science instead of just listening to reading about it or listening to somebody talk about it. You really can't beat the hands-on aspect. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's how you really
Uh,
get kids to love it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We are getting very close to 9:30, so I hate to cut this discussion off because I can't say enough good things about the Ontario Science Center. But we should probably move on to the next history item, which is another September 29th, but this time in 1988, which was the launch of the STS-26 space shuttle mission. Now, one of the reasons STS-26 is a pretty memorable and pretty significant mission for NASA is because it was the first space shuttle launch and mission following the Challenger disaster in 1986. So what happened with the Challenger space shuttle was it exploded a few minutes after launch, which ended up killing the 7 astronauts who were on board. So this was a very, very tragic accident, really horrible accident that pretty much rocked a lot of people in NASA and just sort of anybody who was watching the shuttle launch at the time. So NASA, obviously, after this disaster, they ended up going on a hiatus and just stopping all space shuttle missions because at the time, at first, they didn't know what the problem was. So of course, they're not going to risk killing any future astronauts going up in the space shuttle, potentially due to the exact same problem that killed the Challenger crew. So they ended up on a very long hiatus of about 2.5 years where they had no space shuttle missions while the government did an investigation into what caused the disaster and anything that the NASA as an agency could do to prevent that from happening in the future. Ultimately, what the review committee ended up concluding was that the cause of the Challenger accident was a simple O-ring that ended up deteriorating and not functioning properly. So there were these little O-rings that would essentially seal different joints in the solid rocket boosters of the space shuttle. So these are like the bigger components to the space shuttle rocket that would sort of fall off after launch. And there were several O-rings in the joints of these solid rocket boosters that would help to seal them off and prevent any gases that were in the solid rocket boosters from escaping. But what happened on the space shuttle mission in January 1986 for Challenger was that it was just too cold out and the O-rings became quite brittle and wouldn't function properly. So instead of properly sealing the joints, they just failed to function. Some gases ended up leaking out of one of the chambers, which then ended up leading to this massive explosion on the Space Shuttle Challenger. So ultimately, the review committee concluded that there were there were some engineering modifications that needed to be made to the space shuttles to prevent some of this issue from happening again, and also ended up concluding that there were some issues with the NASA culture and the sort of chain of command there that could have also prevented this mission if they just had not launched on a very cold day in January when it would have been too cold for the O-rings to function properly. Now, after 2.5 years pending this review and some sort of management, the way that NASA was managed, some culture changes to the agency, and also a whole whack of engineering modifications to Space Shuttle Discovery, the end of the hiatus, or the hiatus came to an end on September 29th, 1988, when a crew of 5 NASA astronauts launched on Space Shuttle Discovery on STS-26. Now, the crew consisted of all very experienced NASA astronauts who had all flown to space before, which was also something pretty significant about this mission because that was the first time that a NASA crew had all flown to space before and had all been experienced in spaceflight since the Apollo 11 mission or the Apollo era years earlier. Most of the time, they had at least 1 or 2 people or astronauts on the crew who had never actually flown to space before. But I guess NASA just was not taking any chances with STS-26 and decided to just come up with a crew that was all very experienced in spaceflight and who just sort of had the experience to fly on STS-26. So the crew members were Frederick Hawk, Richard Covey, David Hilmers, George Nelson, and John Lounge. The 5 of them launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on the launch pad 39A, which has definitely had a lot of famous space missions launched from that launch pad. And they had a couple of small issues sort of during the testing phases, which engineers were all able to resolve before the launch. And then a couple of more weather delays. They just had bad weather the morning of the launch, which everybody's very used to dealing with some bad weather. But the crew ended up launching and making it to space successfully. The mission lasted for about 4 days, during which they ran a whole variety of sort of experiments aboard the space shuttle, but had ultimately the primary goal of deploying the tracking data relay system and its associated internal upper stage, or the IUS, which would enable sort of better communication between ground control and the space shuttle, any space shuttle missions that went into space, and would eventually be used on the space station in space as well. So this was a pretty important mission just in terms of setting up the space station and preparing for sort of a more permanent human presence in space. Was definitely useful for a lot of future space shuttle missions as well. So following the 4 days, 1 hour, and 1 minute in space, this mission successfully came to an end when the crew landed on the Edwards. So definitely a successful mission for NASA following the Challenger disaster.
Yeah, the Challenger disaster definitely had a lot of wide-reaching impacts on space travel. And for good reason, because it's crazy that just such a small, seemingly inconsequential part could have such insane impacts on so many lives. And yeah, they're definitely well within their rights to make sure everything was as perfect as it could possibly go for the next shuttle missions.
Absolutely. It was also again, like one of the things the review committee had concluded is that it wasn't just the sort of the failure of the O-ring that was the cause of this, but um for people in NASA management had confirmed that it's not a good idea to be launching the space shuttle when it was this cold because the O-rings wouldn't work. So this wasn't like a problem that just sort of came out of left field that nobody would have even thought of. It was an issue that some people did know about, but they still decided to go forward with the launch anyways, which ended in disaster. So it definitely had some further reaching impacts on just the way that NASA is run and sort of the culture of space flight and exploration in NASA, which we'll talk about later. Definitely still has its impacts today with the way that astronauts and the crew rotations to the ISS work even today.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
yeah, so to make sure we get to that news item later on, really interesting, important news item coming up later on. You should also take us away to our last This Week in Space history item.
Yeah, this one will be quick. Thank you. So September 25th, 1992, the Mars Observer spacecraft is launched. So the Mars Observer spacecraft was a mission intended to orbit Mars and figure out more about its magnetic field, atmosphere, and surface, including the topography and surface material composition, as well as the seasonal dust storm patterns. It was basically going to lay the groundwork for future Mars exploration missions, especially things like they wanted to get surface resolution of Mars down to 1 meter per pixel. So they really wanted to know what landing sites would be okay and how the terrain of Mars really was so that they could kind of set up future missions. Now, I say it was intended to do all these things because unfortunately, this mission was not a very big success. It really didn't achieve any of the science objectives it set out to achieve. The launch itself was delayed for 2 years due to some complications with instruments aboard the craft. Some of the instruments intended for use on the MOS were actually left off of the craft entirely due to budgetary constraints and other issues that were happening. And then, like Sana just covered, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster also had an impact on this mission because the Mars Observer spacecraft was supposed to be launched on another space shuttle orbiter. So, along with many other missions, this was kind of delayed, even though it was after the shuttles were back up. But there was a huge backlog of missions because of the Challenger disaster that didn't launch as planned because they really wanted to make sure everything was above board. So the mission finally launched in 1992, and this time it was aboard a commercial Titan III craft. So it began an 11th month journey to Mars where it would enter and remain in orbit for a while. However, 3 days before the MOS was scheduled to enter orbit, ground contact with the spacecraft was lost. And this was likely due to a fuel leakage issue around certain valves that resulted in the rupture of these pressurized lines and therefore damage to the craft. And this happened during when the engine was turned off and restarted for a routine course correction, and it didn't go as planned, and we lost connection with the craft. And however, the mission wasn't completely useless. What NASA was able to use was data on route planning and interplanetary travel data. And like I said before, there were a few instruments that were left off of the craft, and these were fully functioning built instruments that NASA decided to keep at home. So these Mars instrumentation was actually used by the four subsequent Mars orbiter missions. They were able to use these missions and successfully send back data as part of their primary mission objectives. And these four missions were the Global Surveyor, the Climate Orbiter, the Mars Odyssey mission, and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. So all of these missions were able to use parts that were kind of left over from the Mars Observer spacecraft. So it did set the groundwork for future missions, but just not in the way that it really hoped to.
Imagine, all I can think is like, imagine being on the instrument teams that were built, but then just didn't make it on the mission. I would be so upset if I was
Oh,
one of those people.
100%. And then 11 months later, it's kind of a weird sense of relief because all the instruments that actually got sent up didn't have any job to do because there was
Hmm.
no communication.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So I
then
guess it
you
ended
get
up,
your job back later.
yeah. So it did work out in the long run. Um, this is an interesting part of like technology and space that I don't think is pointed out that often, but I don't think a lot of people realize just how old some of the equipment on spacecrafts actually is, because they have to be planned and built so far in advance that you're never really using like today's technology on a lot of space missions. So I guess that's kind of the same thing is true with this spacecraft and some of its instruments is like they did end up being used, but it was like after basically sitting in storage for a few years. Um, definitely is an interesting thing to think about how old some of the technology on spacecrafts are.
Yeah, like the stuff that was used for or that was planned for the MSO, MOS was built in the late 80s and early 90s. You know, it was scheduled for a 1990 launch. And then some of that instrumentation ended up being used for the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which was launched in 2005. So
Oh
a
my God.
massive delay that this thing was collecting dust for so long. And I'm sure the instrument team was upgrading where they could. But yeah, it
Yeah.
and the Mars Recon Orbiter mission was successful. So I guess the
Hmm.
instruments were they did the job that they needed to do.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that kind of gets me, I try not to talk about James Webb all the time, but I think this fits pretty well, is that the sort of the memory on a normal smartphone or a normal computer is actually better than the drive that's on JWST. When you're planning observing on JWST, data volume is like a huge concern because it uses these, I think they're called solid state drives that are just really old and very outdated.
Oh
So
my gosh.
yeah, yeah. So there's a decent amount of planning that goes into how you plan your observing to make sure you're not running over data volume limits on JWST because the recorder is just like, it's just so old. It's not like new technology that would do a
Yeah,
much
they're
better job. But yeah,
they're
that's just what
running Windows
happens.
7 on the JWST.
Yeah, I guess that's just what happens when you got to plan missions so far out in advance and then just wait a very long time for them to launch.
Oh yeah,
Um,
and with the delays that the JWST had,
oh yeah.
none of that's new. None of that's new. That
Yeah.
telescope is 30 years old.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. But you know what? It works. It's doing a fantastic job, the little space telescope. Um, so so all is well with JWST.
We're grateful.
Yeah. But that does bring us to, well, after the midway point in this case, but what should be the midway point. So for those of you who are just tuning in, you're listening to York Universe. We're broadcasting live from the Allan Carswell Observatory at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Please visit our website, yorq.ca/science/observatory for the OPV online chat room. Any questions you might have, or if you are interested in any of our observatory content, we have a lot of cool images floating around the observatory website. So again, please visit us at yorq.ca/science/observatory. Tonight, you're listening to myself, Sana, and Gagan. We've just been discussing some space and astronomy history, including some things that were important to Canada and Ontario, and some other major missions that were run to space by NASA, partly. So we do have a few updates before we start talking about some of the more recent news happening right now. One of those reminders is if anybody would like to come visit the observatory in person and get a look at our 60 centimeter and 1 meter telescopes, we are actually open for a tour this Wednesday in the evening. Tickets are free, as are all of our events, but we do ask that people get tickets ahead of time just so we know how many people are coming and when. Observatory is limited on the number of people we can accommodate in there, so please book your tickets ahead of time. Again, you could just get tickets from yorq.ca/science/observatory for the weekly Wednesday tours. And Gagan, you have a couple of things to talk about for if anyone's interested in observing.
Yes, absolutely. So we are transitioning from the summer sky to the autumn/winter sky. So that means there are a few new constellations that you can keep your eyes out for. Notably, Orion is up in the early morning sky, and there are also a lot of really great planets up for your observing. So if you have a good eye in the evening, Venus is up around sunset, so keep an eye out around dusk. Saturn and Neptune are also up in the early evening and remain up throughout most of the night. And Jupiter, Mars, and Uranus rise around the middle to early hours of the night and are up until the morning. And by early hours of the night, I mean the witching hours. Um, not like 7 or 8 p.m. So if you're up late into 2 or 3 in the morning, you should be able to see Jupiter, Mars, and Uranus. Uranus was actually at opposition on Friday of last week, and Saturn recently, and rings are basically close to edge on. So if you're observing Saturn, you have a really great opportunity to see most of the planet without the rings obstructing your view. So this is an awesome time to get your binoculars out, your telescopes out, and see if you can do some observing on a clear night. Also, you guys are familiar with the International Space Station. We cannot stop talking about it, and you can see it with your very own eyes. No binoculars needed, anytime during the night. So there are several ISS passes that are coming up throughout this week. Thursday, Friday, and Monday of next week have some notably awesome passes. So head over to spotthestation.nasa.gov to put in your location and see when you can see the ISS. It'll give you all the details. What time, how long it'll be up for, and how high the ISS will be crossing the sky. So if you get some really great viewing times, stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on. Lot going on this week for observing. I am particularly excited about Orion. That is my favorite constellation. It has
Oh,
so
me
much cool
too.
stuff in it. I was pleasantly surprised when I looked up at the sky in the morning the other night and it was like, oh, there's Orion sitting right there. So also means the winter is coming, which I'm very happy about too.
Oh yeah, winter observing is unmatched. So, for anybody looking to start off their observing journey, there are a lot of really great um, objects in the winter sky that are fantastic to observe as a new observer that you don't really need a very powerful telescope for. For example, the Orion Nebula, super bright, very easy to see. The Pleiades star cluster, visible with the naked eye on a decent night. Actually, on most nights, even downtown Toronto, we can see the Pleiades. Um, and a few other things that is definitely the Messier objects come out in the later winter months. So we're excited to get some observing time in.
Yeah. Tonight's, if you're willing to stay up all night at this point, you get kind of the best of both worlds. You got some nice summer constellations in the evening, starting to get the winter constellations and the Pleiades in the morning. So combined with the planets, this is a really good time to be like pulling all-nighters and observing.
Yeah, and we still have Andromeda up pretty early in the sky. It's pretty early
Hmm.
in the night. Um, And the Ring Nebula is going to be up still for the next couple of weeks, at least, I should say, early on in the evening. So you'll get some pretty great viewing opportunities.
Oh yeah.
Should we move on to news?
Yes, we definitely should. Getting a little short on time.
We
Yeah.
can talk all day.
Oh yeah. Talk about how awesome observing is. The first this week, or not this week, but the sort of news items recently is from the amazing James Webb Space Telescope, which is James Webb has now spotted a cosmic question mark. We're calling the question mark arc in the sort of background of massive galaxy cluster MAX 0417. So this is a pretty unique instance of gravitational lensing. Lensing is observed in really like all massive galaxy clusters. It's a great way to look for really faint galaxies in the background that you really wouldn't be able to detect otherwise. It just happens when it's kind of like a perfect alignment where there's a galaxy that's directly behind a massive cluster from our point of view. Then when the light from that sort of background galaxy is coming towards us, towards the Earth, its light ends up getting bent and stretched and magnified and just all screwed up by the galaxy cluster that's sitting in between us and the galaxy. It magnifies the light and again also sort of twists it and morphs it into these weird sort of patterns. So occasionally we end up with these unique gravitational lensing conditions, which in this case is called the hyperbolic umbilic gravitational lens, which sort of lenses this background galaxy into a kind of arc that will sort of look like a little bit like the top half of a question mark. So that's exactly what happened in this MAX 0417 cluster, where this background galaxy is basically lensed and has 5 different images of this single galaxy appearing in this galaxy cluster. So it's one galaxy, but its light has just been so messed up and so warped that we're essentially observing it in 5 separate times in the galaxy cluster. And then just by chance, in just the right position, there is an unassociated bright galaxy that looks like the dot in the question mark. So between that unassociated galaxy and this wacky lensed galaxy, you literally have a question mark that's emerging out of the central galaxy in MAX 0417. So this is a really cool sort of chance alignment that is also pretty rare. And it just gives this really cool, sort of awesome looking image that we can observe with JWST. Now, not only is this just simply a really cool thing to look at, but it also helps us learn a lot more about galaxies in the early universe and also the formation of galaxies like the Milky Way galaxy. Now, there's 2 sort of galaxies that are a part of this lensed galaxy that's making the question mark arc. There's one spiral galaxy, sort of typical spiral galaxy, similar to the Milky Way, and that was previously imaged and previously sort of kind of revealed by the Hubble Space Telescope. But the other very interesting part of this question mark pair of galaxies is a very red galaxy. It's very dusty, which makes its light very red. And that galaxy was not very well detected by the Hubble Space Telescope because it's primarily emitting light that James Webb Space Telescope is sensitive to and not the Hubble Space Telescope. So Webb and Hubble, especially together, have revealed like a pretty unique picture of what these 2 galaxies from the question mark arc are making. That's kind of an interesting thing to say, quickly. So sorry if I was getting jumbled around there, but the question mark arc is kind of a lot to say fast. But between the pair together, scientists have been learning more about what triggers star formation in these kinds of galaxies, which will help to understand the star formation history of galaxies, how galaxies like the Milky Way were able to actually grow and evolve. So very important just from understanding how star formation and galaxy evolution happens, and also understanding more about what the Milky Way would look like. Now, the Milky Way itself is kind of particularly important to this picture because at the time that we're observing these galaxies, existing a few billion years in the past. So you're essentially looking at what the Milky Way would have been like as a teenager. Of course, we're not observing the Milky Way itself, but we're observing something that's very similar to the Milky Way. So understanding these galaxies and the way that they're forming and evolving, and turns out interacting with each other as well, will sort of help us to understand more about the history of the Milky Way. So I think this is a pretty awesome little thing. This also comes out of the Canucks collaboration, the Canadian Nearest Unbiased Cluster Survey collaboration, that I am a part of. So I remember when we kind of first got these images, I was very new to the Canucks team at the time, and this was definitely the most like striking part of the Max 0417 image, was this really cool wacky arc in the image, which I think has to be one of the most interesting lensing arcs that I've actually seen in JWST data. So it's really nice to see this paper getting a little bit of love from NASA in this press release.
We will do anything to make an acronym funny and relatable. Like,
okay, so I was looking up. I was just sort of looking around on the JWST programs page. There's a program called Meow. The acronym
meow.
for the program is Meow. Yeah, like cat meows.
Oh my goodness.
That's the actual acronym. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it was just so entertaining to me that there's an actual JWST program. This is the name that shows up on the Space Telescope Science Institute official webpage that is actually called Meow. It's an
That,
exoplanet program.
oh my goodness. What do you have the initials or, what
I'm
it's
just
meant to
looking
be?
up the MIRI survey for exoplanets orbiting white dwarfs.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
That is
I
incredible. I expect
so
nothing
yeah,
less.
yep. That's like, I don't know, that's my favorite name for a JWST program. There's some pretty interesting ones out there. But I think Meow takes the cake.
No, Meow's incredible. That's whatever team managed that for their instrumentation. I know they were proud of themselves. I know they had to give themselves a little pat on the back.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they must have cats too.
Oh, have to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Stunning. We gotta have like a dog team, like like Woof or something like that.
I know. I'm submitting another proposal for the next cycle for JWST. So if you can help me come up with an acronym for dog, I am absolutely down to name the proposal that.
Oh my God. Okay, so next time on York Universe, when both of us are on, we're getting in calls for potential acronyms for the mission or the project.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Meow one works so well too. Some of the acronyms are they're just weird. Like somebody clearly wanted a certain acronym and kind of worked backwards, but I think Meow works really well.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Similar
nothing, it's
to
not a
Canucks,
stretch.
actually. Yeah.
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 Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right.
So
Yeah,
I'll
I could
quickly cover our last news item. I mean, yeah, of course, don't worry about it.
I could talk about JWST and the question mark arc for a while. So please
Oh,
go ahead with our other a very important news item.
you'd be very welcome to, by the way. 100%. Okay, so we have an interesting situation aboard the ISS right now. In June of 2024, two astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, visited the ISS aboard the Boeing Starliner, and this was the first crewed mission of the Boeing Starliner. The Starliner has had some issues in terms of both launch attempts as well as the mission itself. So there were actually three different launch attempts of the Boeing Starliner before they were able to get this thing going on the third attempt. And this was basically just going to be a quick 8-day mission. They were unstocking some emergency supplies and they were going to get right back in the Starliner and come right back home after a week. However, there was an equipment malfunction with the thrusters on the Starliner as it approached the ISS while docking. And NASA and JPL basically decided, or NASA and Boeing decided that they were going to delay the return of the crew um, to see if they could fix whatever problems were aboard the Starliner before, so they could really ensure that the astronauts had a safe flight back home. Um, so they were troubleshooting for about 3 months, and after this 3 month period, NASA and Boeing actually decided to bring the craft down remotely, uncrewed. So Wilmore and Williams they currently are stranded aboard the ISS, and they don't really have a concrete plan to get down. And this kind of really sucks from an astronaut perspective. You think you're going to be on an 8 day business trip, and suddenly that 8 days has turned into 3 months, and there isn't really any solid plan for you to get back home. It is definitely a much longer trip than they were expecting. Um, they definitely are prepared for space flight, but just a duration of this long without any solid upcoming next steps is definitely tough to handle. The ISS is, of course, very well stocked. There's lots of things for them to do up there. I'm sure they have some science missions that their team has drawn up for them. And, they're going to be up there with the existing ISS crew anyway. So there's not really an issue of what they need to be doing, but it's definitely a huge hiccup in plans. So NASA initially stated that they might not be able to get down until February 2025, where they were going to come back aboard a Crew Dragon. And now, I'm sure much to the relief of the two astronauts, I believe the Crew 9 spacecraft will actually be bringing them down next week. So, in about 9 days, I believe the Crew 9 is heading up with two astronauts. And when the Crew 9 returns to Earth, four astronauts will be coming down. So, they are going to be making some space for the extra two astronauts, and they will be coming home after a long few months. And just, I can't imagine what an incredibly long journey this has been for them, because what a I I don't even have many words for it. It's tough to really explain how difficult this must be.
Yeah, not a good time for Boeing.
Oh,
Like,
we could do we have another hour on the air because we could unpack that.
yeah, Boeing, this is sort of like another blow for that company after several very bad things that have been happening. So it's really not a good time for Boeing, especially because they're not even making another capsule to return the astronauts. Like it's going to SpaceX. SpaceX is bringing the astronauts home. Um, so definitely not a very good time for them. And I don't think Boeing executives are too pleased at what's been going on. Um, but I have been like somewhat following this. So this also does tie into the Challenger disaster that we were talking about earlier. Is uh, NASA is still considering what happened on some of these missions, like the Challenger mission, even
Mhm.
today, and just not wanting to repeat that. So those disasters were definitely played a role in the decision to have SpaceX Crew 9 return the astronauts instead of chancing it in the Boeing Starliner capsule, which it did end up the for astronauts to return home because it did come back uncrewed without any problems. But definitely would rather be safe than sorry cases. Um,
Okay, I
so
have an update for this. I'm sorry, I have a correction to make. They are going to be coming down on the SpaceX Crew 9 on the Dragon, which was supposed to be launching tomorrow, or was supposed to be docking with the ISS tomorrow, but the ISS port was actually occupied by the malfunctioning Starliner, so they weren't
oh my
able
god.
to get the Dragon up there. And so they
Hmm.
are going to be up there. They are going to be up there until February, and they're going to come down with the Dragon 9.
Yeah. So it it kind of sounds in one way like it's kind of an inconvenience for the crew to be stuck up there that long, but like come on, if you got to spend more time in space and you're an astronaut, I do think that would be pretty awesome
It would be. And
from some
also,
perspective.
Yeah, even from just a job search perspective, when it comes to being qualified as an astronaut, time spent in space is a qualifying factor. So accidentally earning 8 more months of space flight time um, could really do them wonders for how much they'd be considered for future missions. Sorry, son, are you there? Okay, guys, so we're nearing the end of our show. Sorry, we're dealing with some slight technical difficulties, so we're just going to make sure everything's good to go for you guys. You've been listening to York University Astronomy and Astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. The hosts this evening have been Sana and myself, Guggen. You can always connect with us on Instagram with the handle at York U Observatory and on Facebook at Allan I Carswell Obs. Check out our website for show notes, content, updates, and contact info at www.yorku.ca/science/observatory. Thank